In today's chilling story, we delve into the haunting and twisted tale of Betty Neumar, a woman whose marriages would become the death sentences of multiple men. Known as the Black Widow, Betty Neumar's history of mysterious deaths surrounding her husbands left investigators and the public stunned. But what appeared to be a pattern of tragic coincidences soon unraveled into a dark web of deceit, greed, and murder. Could a woman really be behind the deaths of 4 husbands? Was she a master manipulator, or just a woman driven to desperate extremes? This is the dark story of Betty Neumar. Betty Neumar's case shocked the world, not just because of the number of husbands she lost, but because of the eerily consistent pattern that followed each death. While it's common for people to mourn their loved ones after a loss, Betty's situation was anything but typical. Each time her husband died, she walked away not only free, but also with a sizable life insurance payout. At first glance, these could be dismissed as unfortunate coincidences. But as time passed and more details emerged, the truth became more disturbing. In the world of true crime, there are cases that stand out as symbols of calculated malice, and Betty's case fits that mold perfectly. Her actions raise questions that go beyond the criminal to probe the darker side of human nature. What drives someone to murder for money? How does someone appear so innocent, so unassuming, only to hide a deadly secret beneath the surface? Betty Neumar's story is a cautionary tale, a glimpse into the psyche of a woman willing to go to any lengths to secure her own financial future, even if it meant taking the lives of those who loved her. As we uncover the details of Betty's life and the men she manipulated, we will explore how this case unfolded, from the moment she was suspected of foul play to her eventual trial and conviction. The truth behind the mysterious deaths of her husbands reveals a chilling story of a woman who was able to outsmart those around her for decades. But as we will see, every lie has its breaking point, and eventually, the truth was too overwhelming to ignore. So let's take a closer look at Betty's life and her path to infamy, a path that led her straight into the annals of criminal history. Betty Neumar's story begins with a childhood that, on the surface, seemed no different from many others. Born in the early 1930s in Georgia, Betty grew up in a quiet, modest household. Her early years were marked by little more than the usual struggles of a working-class family. Betty's parents worked hard to make ends meet, and her upbringing instilled in her a sense of responsibility and the understanding that life wasn't easy. However, there were whispers that Betty's childhood was not as picture-perfect as it appeared. In interviews and later accounts, some claimed that Betty had always been a woman driven by ambition and a desire for something more than what her life had offered her so far. She was described as a beautiful woman, one who had a certain allure that attracted men, even from a young age. She was quick to find suitors, and it wasn't long before Betty entered her first marriage in her early 20s. This man, Charles Neumar, was a man of considerable wealth, and their marriage seemed to promise a better life for Betty. They had 2 children together, and for a time, their family seemed idyllic. But this first marriage would be the first step in a cycle that would define Betty's entire adult life. Charles Neumar's death in 1950 was sudden and unexplained. Doctors attributed it to a heart attack, and there was no reason to suspect foul play at the time. Betty, devastated by the loss, found herself a widow far too young, and with her first husband's passing came a large life insurance payout, enough to ensure that she would be financially comfortable for a time. In the years that followed, Betty found herself alone, but empowered by her newfound independence. For a woman like Betty, however, being alone was never an option. Within a short period, she married again, and her second husband would soon meet a fate remarkably similar to her first. James Neumar, her second husband, passed away in 1965 under circumstances that, to most, seemed entirely natural. Once again, doctors attributed his death to a heart attack. Betty collected another life insurance payout and was free to start again, with little scrutiny on her finances or her personal life. It was at this point that whispers began to surface. Could Betty have been responsible for the sudden deaths of her husbands? Was there more to these incidents than met the eye? Some close to Betty started to speculate, but at the time, there was no evidence to suggest she was involved in anything nefarious. Instead, she was seen as a grieving widow, a woman simply unlucky in love. But Betty's third marriage would soon make things more complicated. She married for the third time, this time to a man named Thomas Neumar. Once again, the pattern repeated itself. In 1970, Thomas was found dead, another heart attack, and Betty, once more, was left widowed and financially secure. The dots were beginning to connect for some, but it wasn't enough to draw any concrete conclusions. As Betty's story continued to unfold, so did the strange circumstances surrounding each death. It became evident that Betty's luck had run out, and it was only a matter of time before her past caught up with her. Betty Neumar's pattern of husbands dying under mysterious circumstances became undeniably troubling after her third husband's death in 1970. With 3 dead husbands, all under seemingly natural causes, one would expect Betty to take some time to reflect. But instead, she married again. The man she wed this time was Harold Neumar, a man with whom she seemed to share a bond. Yet Harold would become the one who would unravel Betty's carefully constructed life. Harold Neumar's death in 1981 was the pivotal moment that led authorities to take a closer look at Betty. Unlike the others, Harold's death raised red flags from the beginning. While he had been struggling with health issues, investigators began to wonder whether there might be something more sinister at play. As they began digging into Betty's history, they discovered the unsettling pattern. Every time a husband died, Betty inherited his life insurance policy, a sum that seemed to increase with each passing year. And in every case, the deaths seemed to be sudden, convenient, and entirely plausible. At first, the deaths were chalked up to heart attacks, strokes, and natural causes. But the repetition made it nearly impossible to ignore. What stood out in this case was the consistency. Betty's husbands weren't just dying one after another. They were all dying under circumstances that would benefit her financially. No one wanted to believe that a woman who appeared so innocent could be behind such a sinister plot. But as investigators reviewed Betty's past, they began to uncover the disturbing connections that pointed toward a more deliberate cause. It became clear that Betty had orchestrated her husband's deaths with cold precision. She had a clear understanding of how to manipulate the situation, collecting life insurance policies each time a husband passed away. But Betty's manipulative tendencies extended beyond just her marriages. Her relationships with her husbands were not founded on love or companionship, but rather on a calculated scheme to improve her financial position. And with each husband she married, the stakes grew higher. Her marriages were more than just unions. They were opportunities for her to secure her future, no matter the cost. By the time Harold Neumar died, Betty had acquired a substantial amount of wealth through these deaths. But Harold's death would be the final straw that led to her exposure. As investigators pieced together the events surrounding each of her husband's deaths, they began to suspect that Betty had been a calculating serial killer, using her charm to lure unsuspecting men into her web, only to kill them once she had secured their money. Betty's ability to appear innocent, even kind-hearted, made her the perfect candidate to deceive those around her. Her ability to manipulate the men she married into thinking they were her true loves, only to dispose of them when they were no longer of use to her, marked her as one of the most dangerous and cold-hearted criminals to ever exploit a romantic relationship for financial gain. By the time Betty Neumar's fourth husband, Harold, had passed away, she had already made a name for herself as a woman whose husbands tragically died one after another. But as much as each death appeared as a random event or a series of unfortunate coincidences, the question that began to arise was whether Betty herself had something to do with it. Could this seemingly sweet, grieving widow really be behind the deaths of multiple men? The answer to that question would only become more apparent as authorities began to dig deeper into Betty's financial history and personal motives. After each husband's death, Betty's life continued with a striking lack of consequence. She moved on quickly, each time benefiting from the life insurance policies she had secured during her marriages. The payouts she received were substantial, enough to keep her financially independent and living comfortably. At no point did anyone seem to question how or why her husbands kept dying at such inopportune moments. By all outward appearances, Betty was simply a woman who had tragically lost her husbands. But there were people who suspected that her financial motivations went far deeper than simple grief. Betty's access to the life insurance policies was a central factor in her continued ability to live the way she did. Each policy payout gave her a cushion, allowing her to live freely without the burden of financial instability. The money from these policies, in essence, was the fuel for her future. And yet, despite the seemingly large payouts, Betty's life was far from easy. Despite her outwardly calm demeanor, she had to continually reinvent herself. With each death came an opportunity for a fresh start. She was able to continue her life without having to confront the consequences of her actions, at least not immediately. Betty was not a woman who wanted to be seen as dependent on anyone, least of all the men in her life. This pattern of using her husbands for financial gain would not be disrupted by love or loyalty. For Betty, marriage seemed to serve one primary function: to secure her wealth. Whether it was her first husband, Charles, or her fourth husband, Harold, each man was a stepping stone, a means to an end. And while the men who married her may have thought they were loved, the truth was far darker. They were nothing more than pawns in a game that only Betty truly understood. As Betty continued to move through life with the benefits of her husband's deaths, her lifestyle didn't seem to change much. She maintained an air of normalcy, keeping up appearances and avoiding any direct attention from authorities. She lived in a small, quiet community, blending in with the people around her, acting as though she was just another widow mourning the loss of her spouse. There was no outward sign of the cold calculation beneath the surface. No hint that this woman had, in fact, orchestrated the deaths of those closest to her for financial gain. And yet, the closer investigators looked, the more it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Betty's financial motivations were becoming clearer, and investigators began to piece together the timeline of her husband's deaths. It was no coincidence that with each passing, Betty's wealth grew significantly. Each time a husband passed away, Betty stood to gain thousands, sometimes even hundreds of thousands, of dollars, thanks to the life insurance policies she had secured. These sums were not insignificant. They provided Betty with an opulent lifestyle and financial security, regardless of her personal circumstances. What investigators eventually discovered was that Betty had been ruthless in her pursuit of wealth. She understood how to play the game of life and death, how to get what she wanted from her husbands without ever lifting a finger in violence. She used her charm and beauty to win their affection and their trust, all while planning to eliminate them once they served their purpose. By the time Betty's fourth husband passed, she had become adept at hiding in plain sight, appearing to be the innocent widow, while secretly enjoying the fruits of her deadly scheme. The true scope of Betty's actions was not revealed overnight. It wasn't until the investigation into Harold's death began that the authorities started to connect the dots. They looked into the insurance policies for each of Betty's deceased husbands and found a disturbing pattern. Each payout seemed to come just after the man's sudden, unexpected death. It was a sequence that couldn't be ignored. With Harold's death being the most recent and most suspicious, investigators began to closely examine Betty's involvement. They found evidence that she had been living off these life insurance payouts for decades. It seemed like she had built her entire life on the idea that her husband's deaths were her financial opportunity, an opportunity that she had taken advantage of time and time again. And yet, Betty's life after each husband's death wasn't just about surviving financially. It was also about rebuilding her life in the aftermath, always looking for the next opportunity. With her fourth husband gone, Betty's story didn't end with his death. Instead, it marked a turning point in her life, the moment when the authorities began to pay attention to her and her repeated cycles of widowhood. It would only be a matter of time before they would connect her to the deaths of the men who had loved her, and the walls of her deception would begin to close in. Betty Neumar's ability to collect these substantial insurance payments after each husband's death was a testament to her cunning and manipulation. It was a deadly game of wealth building through murder, and Betty was playing it like an expert. Each life she took helped secure her future, and with every passing year, she grew more confident in her ability to get away with it. But as her web of lies and deceit grew more complex, it also became more vulnerable. Eventually, the authorities would uncover the truth, but Betty's manipulation of the system had allowed her to evade suspicion for far too long. As Betty's story continued to unfold, one couldn't help but wonder, how many more deaths would it take for someone to finally see through the facade of the sweet widow? How much longer would Betty's deadly game continue before someone caught on to the true nature of her actions? The investigation into her life would reveal a chilling pattern. But it wasn't just the money that made Betty's story so unsettling. It was the coldness with which she conducted her life, the casual ease with which she disposed of her husbands to benefit herself, and the fact that for years, no one questioned her motives. In the end, Betty Neumar was a woman who had used her husbands as stepping stones to wealth and freedom, and her life would never be the same once the truth was uncovered. By the time Betty Neumar's fourth husband, Harold, died in 1981, investigators were beginning to take a closer look at the pattern of deaths surrounding her. It was no longer just a series of coincidences. This was a woman whose husbands had died under mysterious circumstances, and in each case, she had received large life insurance payouts. Although the first deaths might have been written off as accidents or natural causes, the mounting evidence raised serious concerns about the woman behind them. It wasn't until the 1980s, when Harold Neumar's death was scrutinized, that Betty's past began to unravel. Authorities had been suspicious for some time, but it wasn't until Harold's death that they began to gather enough information to investigate Betty seriously. Harold's death, while not immediately suspicious, was the tipping point. He had been suffering from health problems, but there were lingering doubts that his death was entirely due to natural causes. The authorities began to look deeper into his medical records, financial transactions, and even Betty's history. It was at this point that investigators started to realize they had a much bigger case on their hands than they initially thought. At the same time, a growing number of people who knew Betty began to come forward. They had witnessed her behavior and started to connect the dots. They noticed the pattern of her marriages, the sudden deaths of her husbands, and the seemingly convenient way she would inherit substantial sums after each tragedy. Friends, neighbors, and even family members started to question her motives, and rumors began to circulate. The whispers surrounding Betty Neumar grew louder. The woman who had once been seen as a grieving widow was now being painted as something far more sinister, a black widow in the truest sense of the word. Investigators began to dig into Betty's past, looking for any signs of foul play that could tie her to the deaths of her previous husbands. What they found shocked them. Betty had married multiple times, each marriage ending in the unexpected death of her spouse. Each husband's death was followed by a sizable life insurance payout. Betty's financial history was thoroughly examined, and investigators quickly realized that she had collected a small fortune in life insurance proceeds after each husband's death. The authorities soon learned that Betty had been married at least 4 times, with each of her husbands dying unexpectedly. There was one common thread linking all of these deaths: Betty Neumar. As investigators connected the dots, they discovered an unnerving pattern. The deaths of Betty's husbands weren't just a string of tragic accidents. They were a series of calculated murders. Betty Neumar was a woman who had learned how to manipulate the system and use it to her advantage. She had been able to navigate through life as a widow, collecting insurance payouts each time a husband died, without ever arousing suspicion. But now, with the deaths of 4 husbands under her belt, authorities had enough evidence to start building a case. The investigation grew more intense as detectives began questioning Betty about her involvement in the deaths of her husbands. She denied any wrongdoing, of course, but as the evidence mounted, it became clear that Betty had been living a life filled with deception and manipulation. She had carefully planned the deaths of her husbands, ensuring that she would inherit their insurance money and move on to the next target. Betty's charm and ability to present herself as an innocent widow were not enough to shield her from the growing scrutiny surrounding her actions. Betty was eventually arrested, but not before a public outcry. The case drew national attention, with people stunned by the idea that a woman could be responsible for the deaths of multiple husbands. The media had a field day with the story, and Betty's arrest made headlines across the country. The woman who had once been seen as a sweet, grieving widow was now a prime suspect in a series of murders, each one motivated by greed and a desire for financial security. Betty's arrest marked the beginning of the end for her reign of terror. As more details about her past were uncovered, investigators were able to piece together the true extent of her crimes. The lives of her husbands had been nothing more than stepping stones to her ultimate goal: wealth. And with each death, she had gotten closer to securing her financial future, no matter the cost. Betty's manipulation of her husbands, her charm, and her ability to avoid suspicion for so long were a testament to her cunning and ruthlessness. The arrest of Betty Neumar was a turning point in the case, but it was just the beginning of a long and complicated legal process. The authorities were now tasked with proving that Betty had intentionally killed her husbands for money. The evidence was stacked against her, but would it be enough to convict her? The trial would reveal the full extent of Betty's deadly scheme, but the question remained: how far would she go to protect her secrets? Betty Neumar's trial was a media spectacle from the start. With the eyes of the public upon her, Betty found herself in the uncomfortable position of being the center of a criminal investigation that would challenge everything she had spent years building. Her once innocent facade had been shattered, and now she was facing charges that could send her to prison for the rest of her life. The prosecution's case against Betty was strong. They had a wealth of evidence that suggested she had orchestrated the deaths of her husbands, using her marriages to collect life insurance payouts. Each of her husbands had died under similar circumstances, all of which conveniently allowed her to inherit their insurance money. The authorities were able to show that Betty's motives were clear: money. With each husband's death, Betty was able to secure her future, all at the cost of their lives. The prosecution presented a detailed timeline of Betty's marriages and the deaths that followed. They highlighted the similarities between each of the deaths: all sudden, all unexplained, and all followed by large insurance payouts to Betty. The evidence was compelling, and it was difficult to deny that Betty had been involved in some way. But the defense was determined to argue that these were just coincidences, that Betty had not intended to harm anyone. Betty's defense team tried to paint her as a grieving widow who had simply suffered a string of tragic losses. They argued that the deaths were all natural, and that Betty had no reason to kill her husbands. They presented her as a woman who had been unlucky in love, a victim of circumstances rather than a calculating killer. But the jury wasn't convinced. The prosecution's case was simply too strong, and the evidence of Betty's financial gain from each death was too hard to ignore. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty. Betty Neumar was convicted of the murder of her fourth husband, Harold. But the case didn't end there. Investigators continued to look into her past, and there were questions about whether Betty had been responsible for the deaths of her other husbands as well. Some believed that Betty had been involved in the deaths of all four of her husbands, and that her pattern of behavior had been a calculated attempt to secure her financial future. But the focus of the trial remained on Harold's death, and Betty was sentenced to life in prison for her involvement in his murder. Betty Neumar's conviction was a victory for justice, but it raised even more unsettling questions about the nature of her crimes. Was Betty Neumar a cold-blooded killer who had used her charm and manipulation to orchestrate a series of murders? Or was she simply a woman who had found herself in a series of tragic circumstances? Whatever the answer, her story left an indelible mark on true crime history, and the chilling legacy of the Black Widow would live on. Betty Neumar's case remains a source of intrigue for true crime enthusiasts and investigators alike. While she was convicted of murdering her fourth husband, the question remains: could she have been responsible for the deaths of her other husbands? The evidence against her was strong in Harold's case, but many still wonder whether Betty's deadly actions went beyond just one victim. Some theorists believe that Betty's manipulative behavior went far deeper than anyone realized. She had been able to elude suspicion for so long because she knew exactly how to play the role of the innocent widow. Her ability to charm and deceive those around her made it difficult for anyone to see the dark truth beneath the surface. Could she have been responsible for all of her husband's deaths? The idea that Betty was a calculating serial killer who killed not out of desperation, but out of pure greed is a theory that continues to captivate those who study her case. Others believe that Betty's actions were driven by desperation and the need for control. Maybe she wasn't a cold-blooded killer, but a woman pushed to extreme measures by a series of unfortunate events. She may have seen her marriages as a way to secure her financial future, but did she really set out to kill her husbands? Or did it happen because she was willing to do anything to maintain her independence? The truth may never be fully known, but Betty Neumar's story continues to raise unsettling questions about the lengths some people will go to for money and power. Her case serves as a chilling reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that even the most innocent-looking people can harbor dark secrets. Betty Neumar's conviction sent shockwaves through the public, but what came next for her was just as compelling as the crimes she committed. The woman who had carefully orchestrated the deaths of 4 husbands, all for the sake of financial gain, now found herself on the other side of the justice system. Sentenced to life in prison for the murder of her 4th husband, Harold, Betty's days of manipulation and deception were officially over. But her time behind bars would be far from quiet. Upon entering the prison system, Betty's reputation as a Black Widow followed her. It wasn't just the authorities and the media who had an interest in her case. Fellow inmates also took notice of the woman who had turned her marriages into a deadly game of wealth accumulation. Betty, once the manipulative mastermind behind a series of shocking murders, was now a convicted felon, and the world that once saw her as a grieving widow now knew her true nature. In prison, her life would be drastically different from the comfortable existence she had enjoyed for so long. Incarceration did little to change Betty's nature. According to reports, she maintained a sense of calm and composure even in prison. Many prisoners, when faced with the harsh realities of their actions and the consequences of their crimes, tend to become emotional or break down. But Betty remained eerily composed, never showing the signs of remorse or regret that one might expect from someone who had been caught after years of deception. She never fully acknowledged the depth of her manipulations or the lives she had destroyed to secure her own future. Instead, she quietly served her time, much like she had lived much of her life, under the radar and without direct confrontation. Betty's life in prison wasn't marked by a rapid downfall. Rather, it was a prolonged period of isolation and quiet reflection, or perhaps a lack thereof. She rarely expressed remorse for her actions, maintaining a somewhat distant attitude towards the crimes she had been convicted of. Instead, she focused on maintaining her sense of control, something that had defined her throughout her life. Whether it was through interactions with other prisoners or through correspondence with the outside world, Betty continued to be a woman who carefully managed how others saw her, even if she had no control over her own fate anymore. Despite her calm and composed demeanor, there were moments of tension in Betty's prison life. Her case had attracted attention not just for the chilling nature of her crimes, but also for the cold, methodical way she had gone about securing her wealth. Her story was one that had captivated the media, and so naturally, there were some in the prison system who couldn't resist taking advantage of her notoriety. Some inmates viewed her as a manipulative figure who had outwitted the authorities, while others saw her as a symbol of justice being served, a woman who had finally paid for her sins. Prison officials also kept a close eye on Betty, knowing that she was a high-profile inmate. They were aware of her history and the fact that she had a reputation for being both charming and calculating. While she was not a physical threat to others in the prison, her ability to manipulate situations and people remained intact. Many inmates described her as someone who could easily blend in and avoid trouble, a woman who kept to herself but was always very aware of her surroundings. Betty wasn't someone who sought confrontation. Rather, she had become adept at quietly navigating her environment, just as she had done throughout her life. One of the most striking aspects of Betty's life in prison was her ability to maintain a sense of control. Even behind bars, she held on to a certain level of power over her situation. Whether through her charm, her ability to maintain a low profile, or simply by staying out of trouble, Betty managed to survive without drawing too much attention to herself. This, however, did not mean that she was immune to the pressures of prison life. Though she wasn't physically attacked, she had to adjust to the harsh realities of living in a correctional facility, a far cry from the comfortable existence she had once known. In a way, Betty's prison life mirrored her earlier years. She kept her emotions in check, continued to manipulate those around her when necessary, and rarely let her true feelings show. Her case remained a subject of fascination for many, but Betty herself seemed to view it as a chapter of her life that had simply ended. She wasn't a woman who dwelled on the past or let regret shape her actions. Instead, she chose to focus on maintaining the same level of control that had gotten her through her marriage to 4 unsuspecting men. As the years went by, Betty continued to serve her life sentence. While she never fully confessed to all of her crimes, her conviction for Harold's murder remained the cornerstone of her sentence. The prison system, while keeping a close watch on her, also monitored the public interest in her case. Many people had questions about how Betty had managed to get away with so much for so long, and the ongoing fascination with her story didn't wane. For some, Betty represented the worst kind of deception, a woman who had killed not out of self-defense or passion, but purely for greed. Her time in prison was marked by the quiet knowledge that, despite the public outcry, Betty had once again been able to manipulate the situation to her advantage. She had no intention of apologizing for her actions, nor did she seem to care about the lives she had destroyed. For Betty Neumar, prison was simply another part of her life story, a part that she had to endure in much the same way she had endured everything else in her life, by remaining calm, composed, and always looking out for herself. The question that remains, even after Betty Neumar's conviction, is whether she would ever come to terms with her actions. Would she ever admit the full extent of her manipulation, her role in the deaths of her husbands, or the coldness with which she had orchestrated their murders? Or would she continue to live out her days in denial, maintaining the control she had fought so hard to preserve throughout her life? Betty Neumar's story is a tragic reminder that true evil often wears a mask of innocence, and that even those who seem incapable of causing harm can hide dark secrets beneath the surface. Her life behind bars may not have been filled with dramatic confrontations or emotional outbursts, but it was filled with the quiet knowledge that she had been caught, and that the truth had finally come to light. But the larger question still lingers. How many more lives could Betty have destroyed before her deadly pattern was stopped? And how many other women like her may have gone undetected, using their charm and manipulation to secure their futures at the cost of those they claimed to love? Betty Neumar's story is a chilling one, a case where a woman used her marriages as weapons, and the consequences of her actions will forever be remembered in the annals of true crime history. Betty Neumar's case is a powerful reminder of how manipulation and greed can shape the most unsuspecting of individuals. For years, she walked the line between victim and villain, playing the role of the grieving widow while secretly plotting her next step toward financial gain. In the end, her actions caught up with her, and the truth behind her cold, calculated actions was finally revealed to the world. While Betty may have spent her life trying to outwit the system and those around her, it was the justice system that eventually caught her. The story of Betty Neumar serves as a cautionary tale for us all, reminding us that appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the veneer of charm and innocence, some people harbor dark, deadly secrets. The Black Widow's reign of terror ended in prison, but the scars left by her actions will linger for years to come, both for the families of her victims and for society's understanding of how far someone can go to secure their own selfish desires. Betty Neumar may have thought she could escape the consequences of her crimes, but in the end, justice prevailed. Though she tried to hide behind her carefully crafted persona, the truth came to light, and she was held accountable for the lives she had destroyed. As we reflect on her case, we're reminded of the fragility of trust and the chilling reality that sometimes the most dangerous people are those we least expect.